I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we're dedicating our entire show to the fallout from New York City's dramatic Democratic mayoral primary, where State Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani has declared victory over former Governor Andrew Cuomo. It's a race that has laid bare the divide between the party's progressive and establishment wings.
Tonight is his night. He deserved it. He won. And we're going to take a look. We'll make some decisions. But I love each and every one of you, and I thank you for what you've done. Thank you very much.
And we are now building in the dawn. That new day, the one that we have yearned for, the one that we have struggled for, the one that we have knocked for, have texted for, have called for, the one that we have obsessed over. That new day is finally here, my friends.
Joining me today for a roundtable discussion are three New York Times Metro reporters who have been at the center of the story. Maya King has been closely following the voters and key issues shaping this year's campaigns. Christopher Magg has provided in-depth analysis on the cultural dynamics influencing the race. And John Leland has recently examined the realities of life in New York, offering a unique perspective on a city at a pivotal crossroads. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I want to start off with you, Maya, a little bit. I had the pleasure of working on a story with you about shifts in Black political power, and apparently Mr. Mamdani won without a majority of Black voters, which is somewhat of a historic shift. I'm wondering, what do you think that means for traditional Black power in New York City?
That's right, and I think that's what a lot of Black power brokers are wondering as well. Mamdani was able to win with about a third Black support, and we also found, of course, in our reporting, some generational shifts there. And I think what this means, one, is that the power of Black voters and Black leaders may not be as potent, at least in a primary. And it also underlines the work that the Mamdani campaign will have to do to make up the ground that they lost with Black voters, because they do remain a very influential voting bloc in New York and could very well make the difference in the general election.
Yeah, what do you think Black leaders are going to do about this this situation? You know, this sort of, they're important part of this coalition, which maybe now appears to be a little shaky. I'm wondering, how are they going to address that with Mr. Mamdani?
Yeah, I mean, from conversations that I had with some Black leaders, they seem to suggest that they're ready to sit down and have some conversations with the Mamdani campaign and with his allies about some of his policy proposals, to talk to him about what their own priorities in their communities are and what it's going to take for them to get their voters back to the polls for Mamdani this November. I think another thing, too, that they realize they have to do is more organizing work, having more conversations with Black voters at the doors and in Black communities across New York about what Mr. Mamdani stands for and whether they will support him.
So another first, Chris, is that if Zohran wins the primary and goes on to become mayor, he would be the city's first Muslim mayor. You wrote a little bit about that, and I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about the idea that younger Muslims sort of maybe drag their parents along with them to support Zohran. Tell me what you found about that.
Absolutely. So that was the dynamic that came from interviewing people yesterday in Richmond Hill, was to find out that, you know, I was speaking to parents who were in their 50s, and they're on Facebook. They're not social media illiterate, but their children really are on all of the social media. And so the parents would have heard about Mamdani and the race in general, but their children really did say, how about this, how about this, how about this? And they were really in their face and were acting like campaign volunteers, even though the campaign had no idea they existed. And classic get out the vote work, including, Mom, leave work, go to the polls. So I thought that dynamic was really interesting in terms of young people who really had nothing to do with politics in their whole lives were involved and engaged in this campaign.
So do you think the social media played a role in sort of getting at people in sort of some of these neighborhoods that hadn't gotten attention previously?
I do think so. I think the campaign wants to stress the fact that none of their social media presence would have worked without the candidate going to these neighborhoods in person many times and making the videos, because he didn't do a lot of studio shots, he didn't do a lot of memes, he was in the neighborhoods. But the people that I spoke to didn't have time to go to those events. They saw it entirely on their phones. And I think that those two things worked really well together.
John, Zoran, one of his biggest, perhaps his biggest campaign issue has been affordability for New York City. He's talked about having free buses and freezing the rent for some folks. I'm wondering, you wrote recently about the state of life in New York City, whether it's on the decline or on the rebound. I'm wondering how you think that may have played into some of the results we saw this week.
Well, Dodai Stewart and I and the photographer Todd Heisler tried to capture what the mood of the city was. You know, we're 5 years out of COVID, and we went to the black barber shop, we went to the high-end real estate broker, we went to the guys running the food truck, the subway train operator, just to try to feel like what people are feeling now.
Right.
And what we found is kind of what you might think 5 years after COVID. COVID really atomized the city. We just divided us. There was inequality and gaps between us before. COVID just exposed those and expanded them. So everybody was kind of in their own lane. And all the people we talked to seemed to almost inhabit different cities. So, without these kind of coherent bonds between people that are always a little frayed, but they were stronger before. Without that, people are voting in very separate lines. They don't have a center. So people were drawn, on one hand, for the early parts of the campaign, to the very kind of more authoritarian candidate, and also to someone who would have been considered a fringe candidate in other times. And I think that fringe candidate becomes more plausible, and that kind of maybe street level enthusiasm that he generated through his charisma, it was more powerful than it might have been in a different election.
Well, you're a longtime New Yorker, and I'm a native New Yorker. It feels like New Yorkers are always like questioning the state of the city. Is it going down? Is it going up? You have this constant influx of new arrivals. I'm wondering if you think Andrew Cuomo made the case that the city was in deep trouble, and that's why his experience was needed. I'm wondering how you think that might have played out with voters based on some of the experiences you had talking with people.
I think it didn't play out as much as well as he thought it would. And he really stressed chaos, and there were two things going on. I think there was affordability and chaos. And both of those are real, and people really felt them and spoke to them. But I think affordability hits people every day, and chaos is sort of out there, something they're absorbing on their screens.
Right.
But you can't afford your child care, or you can't afford to move into a new apartment because you just had a kid or a second kid, or whatever. Those things are like everyday, in your face issues.
Maya, Zoran focused on affordability. I'm wondering, it's for all New Yorkers, but did Black New Yorkers, did that resonate with Black New Yorkers particularly?
It's interesting. I did a lot of reporting over the last few months on Black New Yorkers who feel like they can't afford the city and who are leaving in these large numbers. So it absolutely is an issue that's close to many Black native New Yorkers. But I spoke with one person yesterday who said that they paid close attention to Zoran's campaign and his message, and they were put off a little bit by his idea of freezing the rent. Because he said he talks to, and this was a minister, he said, I minister to many longtime Black New Yorkers who are homeowners and who worked really hard to own homes and to own property in the city, who are also struggling to afford those properties and to keep them up. And so he was wondering, whether now Zoran and Democrats behind him have a plan also for Black homeowners, because that's also an affordability crisis that the city is staring down. And I'll say, to John's point, it's clear that both candidates tapped into a level of dissatisfaction, maybe even unrest in New York, but had very different ideas on how to solve it. And so for Cuomo, it was really just this idea that the city was in chaos, that no one felt safe, that no one really recognized what the city had become. Where with Zoran, there was also an element of recognizing that the city had taken a turn, but also a message that came through with a lot of optimism and joy and love for the city that I think was very palpable, and spoke to a lot of New Yorkers too, who were able to identify with this idea of, yes, I don't love the direction that the city has gone in, but it's still the city that I live in and that I want to stay in.
The black population is shifting. You found that even though it's about the same numbers as it was 20 years ago, that it has sort of changed dramatically. Tell me a little bit about those shifts and how do you think that might play out in the November election?
Well, data across New York shows that the black population has stayed pretty similar over the last several decades. But if you go into certain corners of New York, places like Southeast Queens, southern swaths of Brooklyn, even Harlem, you can see that the demographics have really shifted, that a lot of longtime black New Yorkers no longer live there, and many of them have actually moved to the suburbs. And so we know that black voters are a very important Democratic constituency, very reliable voters, and they tend to vote their interests. And now that that population is shrinking or shifting to other parts of the city or other parts of New York, it shows that there really may be some new policy priorities for a lot of these communities. One example that someone shared with me was, we're no longer talking about housing affordability and cleaning up public parks. We're talking about things like bike lanes and composting. And so the policy priorities, again, in a lot of these communities are changing, which shows, over time possibly could give us some signs for how a lot of these communities may shift as well.
Chris, I'm wondering, Zoran has throughout the campaign, referenced his Muslim faith. He's also talked about getting death threats based on his Muslim faith. I'm wondering if you found any concerns from the people you spoke to about how him being Muslim was being sort of played out in public.
I think if I had been able to speak to a broader swath of people, and especially Muslim leaders, I would have heard more of that. The people I was speaking to, just by luck of who I happened to meet, are not politically involved. This was maybe their first time voting, and definitely for their children, the first time that they were politically active in any way. So for the people that I spoke to, there was relief to say there's someone who looks like me or looks like my nephew, being involved in politics, speaking in a way that I like. He's a good-looking guy, and he's charming, and I like him, and it's exciting. They weren't necessarily looking to that next step of what kind of maybe Islamophobic pushback he and their communities might be getting.
So the personal story seemed important. What about him as an immigrant? Because he was born in Uganda and just became a citizen in 2018, for example. Is that something people saw themselves in him?
They did. The twist that I heard repeatedly was to say he's a New Yorker like me. I came here, or my parents came here from Pakistan or from India, the people that I spoke to, and they did not lead with, we immigrated. They led with, we're New Yorkers.
Right. John, we talk about how the sort of ups and downs of New York sort of exist together. I'm wondering, did you see any sort of conflict in Mamdani's sort of upbeat discussion of the future of the city? I'm wondering how effective you thought that was, especially among people who are debating whether they want to stay here, whether they have a future here.
I think he was unique in that messages in this campaign, and I think that to the extent I can tell, I think it served him well. I should point out that in our conversations, we weren't getting into electoral politics really deeply with people, and the surprising thing is they didn't bring it up. It was very interesting. They're not there was not a strong pull to that, but I think that his campaign was not Pollyanna-ish. Didn't say everything is good. It said we know life is hard here, but this is our place. And I think that the last line in our story is a woman, Ada Calhoun. She says, if you want quality of life and more space, you can move, but it's not going to be New York. And I think that's an attitude a lot of people have. Yeah, this is the worst possible place, but no way I'm leaving.
Right. One scene, you spoke to a barber who talked about how he felt there was a sort of do-it-yourself spirit arising back in the city. He was noticing more pop-up parties and other events. And it feels like Mamdani's campaign had some of that energy too. I mean, tell me about that sort of spirit in New York and how that might affect how people view life in the city.
It was really interesting. The barber is Gregory Purnell, and he's in a place out where Crown Heights and Bushwick and Bed-Stuy and East New York come together under a bunch of railroad tracks. And he's like, yeah, everything's so unaffordable, but because of that, we're swinging back the other way. And we're just not there. But it goes, the city's a little bit speakeasy now. It's a little thing. Some guys had got a party in their basement, or someone's doing a little pop-up, vegan stuff. We see it on the street all the time. People selling empanadas. There's little businesses are popping up because everything else is too unaffordable.
So with black voters, Mr. Mamdani has been using social media, as Chris mentioned, to sort of reach out to younger black voters. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, there seems to be a generational divide, though, going on among black voters there, whereas young voters are responding to that message. Maybe sort of older, home-owning black voters have a little more skepticism about him.
Absolutely. I think home ownership is one of the big fault lines there. Of course, a lot of younger voters, younger people across the city are all renters and maybe don't feel like they'll ever be able to afford homes. And they also feel like, they're really frustrated with establishment Democrats, with establishment politicians, and are really hungry for something new. I think we saw that also last November in the presidential election, where people, particularly young voters, were really frustrated with the Democratic establishment. Some of them shifted to the right, some of them opted not to vote at all. Where now, several months later, here we are, and Mamdani has, thousands and thousands of volunteers, many of whom are much younger. And the same is true of younger black voters, who I think now the onus will be on them to talk to a lot of their older relatives about Mamdani and try to bring them into the fold. And they feel like he has a real message. One of Mamdani's last messages on his social media page was about young black New Yorkers who feel, again, squeezed out of the economy and who feel like they don't have a place to be able to afford the city. And so I think that could be a really galvanizing voting bloc for him.
What do you think is the resistance among older black voters? What's that about?
It's something that I think we'll have to spend the next few months really understanding. But in the days since the election, I think it's a combination of Mamdani being an unknown, of him pushing policies that in the minds of many older, moderate to conservative black voters just don't feel realistic, and also who Cuomo was as a very recognizable name. People remember not only his governorship, but also that of his father, and felt like he would be a mayor in that same mold. And so I think people, particularly older black voters, were kind of going with what they know. And now the question is whether or not they'll step out and go with something that they really haven't really taken the time to understand yet.
It's interesting. That seems to be a theme amongst the city. So among black voters, among Muslim voters, where younger people are sort of kind of maybe guiding their parents on this issue. I'm curious if what kind of arguments were these young folks making to their parents about Zoran?
A lot of it seemed to be more about mood and personality. If you're going up in age, if you're looking at the younger people talking to their parents, they described a lot of showing their phones to their parents and saying, he's nice, he's funny. And the conversation going back down from the older people seemed to be more of, does he have substance? Can you freeze the rent? Does the government running grocery stores make any sense? There seemed to be some sense of, I love you, my son, daughter, nephew. I will vote the way you're saying, but also counseling to say, New York is a complex place. It's hard to get anything done. It's hard, especially for the mayor, to get anything done. And so temper your expectations.
Right. Some people you spoke to thought, in some sense, that he was a little too radical, possibly, with some of his ideas?
I didn't speak to as many people who said that. I think that the parents would be more prone to say that, and they didn't use the word radical. They used the word optimistic.
Right.
A little too much sense from Zoran that of what he could accomplish, and the parents, having been here for decades, saying, slow your roll. You might get one of those 10 things done.
Right. Right. John, I'm wondering if you feel that the city, the sort of divides that we're facing, and the challenges people are facing. I'm wondering that feels like there's a huge difference between people who have jobs that have health insurance and they can afford the rent, and people in certain neighborhoods that are struggling, traditional neighborhoods where there's always been some sort of struggle. I'm wondering how you might see that playing itself out as we move forward in this election.
It's so funny because we really, not only are we divided, but we often don't see the divide. And that's one of the things we're coming, like, you live in your neighborhood and you only see your neighborhood and it's looking fine, and you're not recognizing that the person who brings you that food lives in an entirely different neighborhood and things aren't fine there. So I think that we're going to have to get through that, and there's going to have to be some sort of meeting ground. Again, going back to COVID, the person getting that food delivered didn't have to go to their job. The person delivering the food had to go to their job, and they couldn't afford their child care, while they were doing the job. So they were under stress, and we've kind of lost this empathy for one another. We always don't quite know how the other half is living, but I think we had greater contact with it. We could at least see it across the divide, and now we're not seeing that. And that'll be the responsibility of the mayor to kind of bring that into account and say, like, yes, you're doing pretty well, but you can't afford the place you're living in, or your kids can't afford to move out. You're going through the same things that they're going through, just in a different way.
Did you talk to voters at all about their expectations for the next mayor? What are people expecting out of their city as they make the decision whether to stay here or move elsewhere?
We didn't, and it's funny, a lot of our reporting was done a little while ago when it seemed like the race would go a different way.
Wow, interesting. Maya, some of that surprise, it was a bit of a surprise how well Mr. Mamdani did on the first night. I'm wondering, what do you think Governor Cuomo did wrong in this campaign?
Well, I think for a few things. One, he had a very narrow sense of the electorate. So his campaign largely went to Black churches, union halls, and your more traditional broad festivals like the Puerto Rican Day Parade. And he was able to bring in, pretty traditional Democratic-based voters, namely Black voters and older voters. But that was about it, where Mamdani was expanding the electorate and bringing more people in. And his message was one that spoke to, I think, a broader swath of New Yorkers, and a message that spoke to how a lot of New Yorkers are feeling. Cuomo seemed to have a more traditional approach, and I think his campaign's calculus was that would be enough for him to win, going after these sort of raw political numbers and math based on specific voting blocks. But that really wasn't the case this year. And we also can't discount the elements and the role that they played this year. Election day was very, very hot. And I think that was really trying for a lot of older voters as well. One thing that we found in our reporting on Black voters over the last week was that there was indeed a slight downtick in turnout among Black voters this year, and that's something that we haven't seen in many election cycles in New York before. So I don't think the campaign really accounted for a lot of those changes.
Yeah, I wonder if Mr. Mamdani's victory is a bellwether for what's happening nationally with Democrats. Are there lessons to be learned from how he ran this campaign that national Democrats might want to use as we move into midterm elections?
I think so. I mean, since Harris's loss in 24, a lot of Democrats have said that they have to do a better job of talking to younger voters, of having a message that's exciting and galvanizing, and having someone who can not only give a really great speech and move voters in these more traditional settings, but also sit on long-form podcasts, also be able to cut really slick advertisements and have a social media presence. And Zoran has been able to do all of that. I think what we're hearing from some establishment Democrats right now is more issues with his platform and whether that platform is realistic. But what I also hear from some Democratic strategists is this is still a model that's worth replicating and studying, especially as Democrats head into what is expected to be a pretty rough midterm cycle next year.
So one last question. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, we have heard this before.
Yes.
12 years ago when Bill de Blasio won, we heard that was the new model for the progressive Democrats. 4 years ago when Eric Adams won, that was the model for the new centrist Democrats. So
Perhaps a little caution.
Take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Well, one last question. I'm hoping each of you can answer this in your own way. I'm wondering what you think this election says about the future of New York City and what residents can expect, especially as we head into this November election, which is a competitive election, which is unusual in New York City. So, each of you tell me, what do you think this election might say about the future of New York City? I'll start with you, Chris.
Work matters. Getting out there and meeting people. I think that the traditional ways, that, as you just said, that politicians have used to reach voters are breaking down. And voters want to see your face. Authenticity matters. Authenticity can't be faked. And we are in this new media world where what the New York Times writes and publishes doesn't matter much. What matters is, are you able to be on your phone as the candidate and speak to people in ways that feel authentic? And the more that any politician from any party is able to do that, the more they will succeed.
John, what do you think?
I don't like to prognosticate, but I will say that what I'm struck by is that a campaign that was so upbeat and optimistic resonated with so many New Yorkers, and in a way that I think a lot of people weren't expecting.
Maya?
I think it's that the political coalitions that we're used to winning elections look a little different now. Mamdani not only thanked his staff and his political team, he also thanked Bangladeshi aunties and Gambian uncles. And those are now part of the Democratic coalition here in New York, and I don't think they've ever gotten a shout out before. So it makes me wonder, one, now what does that mean for the future of Democrats and how they govern, but also who are the new power brokers in the city and what do they look like too?
Great. Thanks to you all for joining me, John Leland, Maya King, and Christopher Magg, for a stimulating conversation about the present and future of New York City politics. That's it for this edition of Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff Mays. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app where you can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.